I'd just like to welcome everyone to the forum's monthly online meeting. Thanks everyone for coming. And I'm very pleased to introduce Alison Gordon, who's come from AgeUK Enfield, to do a presentation on dementia and the support available to sufferers in Enfield. And Alison tells me that she welcomes contributions during the presentation because she'd like it to be interactive. But if you do want to say something, it would be useful if you could use the reactions button rather than waving your hand in the air, because we're not likely to see you if you wave your hand in the air. So I'll just hand you over to Alison.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I have got a screen I'm going to share with you as well. I'm Head of Prevention Services at AgeUK Enfield. Prior to coming to AgeUK Enfield 3 years ago, unbelievably, right before the pandemic, I've worked with working age adults, older adults, and my specialism is dementia. So I'm quite happy to run a session today and have any questions fired at me, as long as they're not too clinical, otherwise I probably will struggle. But it's been my passion, and I was very influenced to work with people with dementia because when I was growing up, my grandfather had dementia, and I've carved out a career in working with people to develop services and to develop activities. Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much for that, Alison. That's really great. Thanks for just that bit of input. That's really good. Thank you. I hope that operation happens actually. Okay, let me just share my screen so everyone can see the order of today. No, of course I can't do that because that's ridiculous, Alison. There we go. Okay, so what to expect from today? When I was putting this together, I thought the idea is about what's dementia, types of dementia, signs, symptoms, common behaviours, how to get diagnosis, what to expect, living well with dementia, challenges, person-centred practice, how to get help, local help. Now that's very ambitious in about an hour. So I will take from the group what you really would like to hear. But just to set the tone of the session, the current statistics for people living with dementia at the moment in the UK are 944,000, which is a huge amount. And that number has gone up during the pandemic. And we're expected that to be 1.6 million by about 2040. So it's a huge hike. And that trajectory of people developing dementia, I've been working with people with dementia like for the last 28 years, so it's steadily increasing. And back then in the 90s, we knew there was going to be a huge avalanche of people affected by dementia, and it's steadily growing. So 1 in 14 people over 65 have dementia, but we also know that lots of people under 65 also have dementia as well. So let me just stop sharing for a second because I think it might not show that presentation. The first question I want to pose to you all is, when you hear the word dementia, what do you think? And you can shout out to me because I can't see you. So when you hear the word dementia, what do you think, feel, or understand?
I'll answer. I feel frightened when I hear the word dementia. And I think about very old people wandering around, being lost. That's my image of dementia.
I'm going to put things down in the chat so we've got a record of what people are saying. Normally I'll be writing on a board in front of you as we're doing this. Has anybody else got any thoughts, feelings about what dementia means? Have you seen it in a film, a television series, a soap opera, real life experiences? What are the kind of like feelings or thoughts you have when you hear the word dementia?
I think of being confused, not being able to recognize at the extreme end of people, things that you used to do, but not being conscious that you're doing all of these things or not doing all of these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Conscious and aware, that's really important, isn't it? Thank you for that. Thank you, Olive. And I can see in the chat, there's lots of comments here about someone saying, think you become useless and the liability to society. I think my relatives' friends have been affected, and confusion, loss. There's lots of very, very powerful words being used in the chat and in your sharing today. What would you say the tone of the words are and the descriptors that people are sharing?
What was your question, Alison?
What would you say the tone? What do you think? When all of these words that people have been sharing so far, are they positive or negative?
Negative, very
negative. Very, very negative, aren't they? Yeah. So is there anything positive that anyone could imagine about living with dementia?
No.
Okay.
Unless you can forget trauma, I suppose.
Potentially. That's an interesting one. That I'm going to put that in I'm going to put forget trauma ? Because that's something I want to come back to you actually, because that's quite an interesting thing when we think about emotional memory. So let's just hang on to that one, and hopefully this chat will be able to be visible to me as I go along. So Alison, I just know that your mom's with you, so I'm hoping this isn't too negative for her, who's like part of this discussion as well. And just a sensitivity note, if anyone has got somebody who's affected by dementia sitting and joining this session, we are going to be talking about signs, symptoms and behaviours. So if anybody is affected by that, it can be quite distressing at times, especially if we think about the later stages of dementia. To just a warning over that, really. So everything that everyone has said here is pretty negative, isn't it? And so then this all becomes part of this package of being diagnosed with a condition that most people fear or are absolutely apprehensive about being diagnosed with. And when you think about fearing something or being apprehensive about something, you're not going to necessarily want to go and seek early interventions to do something about it. So lots of people start to have common symptoms and they do nothing about it, because the obvious thing is like, that's frightening, there isn't a cure for this is something which, you know, has such a negative societal, even though the Alzheimer's Society have done tremendous work about campaigning about living well with dementia and changing the tone and like the feelings and showing very fantastic ambassadors of people who are living with dementia and voices of experience, people still drastically fear it. So that's something that we often kind of like, you know, we need to keep there and keep that as a context. Sorry, Alison's got that. My father had it when mum was diagnosed. Okay. Positive is definitely you're spending quality time. Thank you. Oh, and yeah, that's lovely. I'm glad she's enjoying this. Is it Wycliffe John she's enjoying, I hope. Gradual loss of mental capacity. Thank you, Tony. Absolutely spot on. And often blamed on aging. Absolutely. Aging is the common misconception of what people think dementia is. Please tell me that when I'm going through this, my screen's actually moving. You can see the PowerPoint moving, or is it just stuck on one thing? Because sometimes that tends to happen. Can you see this one which says key facts about dementia?
Yes.
Perfect. So dementia is an umbrella term, and it describes a group of symptoms. And most people think about dementia as being disorientation and memory loss. And then people think about the extremities of like agitation, you know, the things that come a lot later. But it's a lot more to that. And it's very individual to you as an individual, because as we grow up, we go through different experiences. We come from different cultural backgrounds. We have different life experiences. And we all have different personalities. If we were to play human bingo right now, every single person would have a different thing that they like and dislike. So there's no two people the same. And certainly for me in my career, I've never seen anybody the same, because nobody is the same. And although there may be similar progressions in types and variants of dementia, nobody reacts or behaves in the same way, and everyone will have a very different experience of it. So dementia is a progressive disease, which means it does get worse. And at the beginning, quite often, people won't notice that they've got dementia, and it will be retrospective that family members will say, oh, actually, I noticed that. You know, a few years after, it can be almost quite insipid. And other times it can seem quite sudden, because the earlier symptoms, again, people have a very good social front, or they're able to disguise it, or they develop coping strategies that get around the things that make you feel to display the differences that you might have. There are about 200 different types of dementia, and dementia being like, you know, the most the umbrella term. What do you think is the most common form of dementia? Alzheimer's, absolutely. And then secondary to that, it was always vascular dementia. But often now, when people are diagnosed with dementia, they'll have like a mixed dementia, and it can be like, you know, an Alzheimer's type with a so-and-so strain. Frontotemporal dementia, or FDT, is becoming quite a common dementia now. And frontotemporal dementia was often called Pick's disease. You know, certainly when I first started in the 90s, people often had Pick's disease, and people who had Pick's disease were often younger. There's quite a genetic link to it. So it might be that your father or mother may have had that, and it affects people very differently, so that they have aphasia, their language is affected, but their memory could be quite intact. So there's a lot of word replacement going on, but also there's a lot of disinhibition. So, hi, are you there? But with the disinhibition, it comes a personality change, and the frontotemporal dementia group of activists often say that it affects people that are very high functioning, or surgeons, people who are in really high pressured or functioning, pilots, people with very responsible jobs. And people think it's a midlife crisis because there's a personality change. It might be that somebody's, had a criminal conviction for the first time in their life. It could be that they buy something very impulsively. And people often think, they tend to be younger, so people think it's a bit of a midlife crisis or something going on with them. And actually, certainly when you listen to people's stories about how they struggle to get a diagnosis of frontotemporal dementia, there's this kind of very sudden change behaviour. There was a chap I was working with when I was in Waltham Forest, and he was a school teacher, and he was a very, very dedicated school teacher. And he worked with young people, and he suddenly started to use inappropriate language, and so a safeguarding was raised, and he was dismissed from his job. And it later transpired that he got a diagnosis of dementia. So it's a very interesting form of dementia. Thank you, Tony, I will do that. Dementia isn't a natural part of aging. It's caused by a disease that damages nerve cells in the brain. So when people say, oh, I just think so-and-so's getting old, or it's just part of getting old and it will happen to everybody as you get older, that's not true. That's a misconception. And it's caused by many, many different diseases that affect the brain, and they affect the brain in different ways. And because obviously there's different parts of the brain, and every part of the brain has a different operating function. There isn't a cure for dementia, but early detection intervention can help a person. So what I'm going to do now is stop sharing this, and I'm going to show you a very short video because it stops you hearing my voice all the time. So let me just come across to that. And let's just show this to you. It's a lovely Australian video, so you have a different accent to mine for 5 seconds. And you should be able to hear this. Tell me.
Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia, and dementia with Lewy bodies. Understanding the symptoms can help in ensuring each person's care needs are met. No two people experience dementia in the same way. What are the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease? In the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, symptoms may be very subtle. You may notice lapses in memory and difficulty in finding the right words for everyday objects. Symptoms can fluctuate and can become worse at times of stress. Other symptoms may include forgetting well-known people or places, deterioration in social skills, loss of enthusiasm for previously enjoyed activities, and emotional unpredictability. What are the symptoms of vascular dementia? Vascular dementia is the broad term which describes dementia associated with problems of circulation of blood in the brain. Symptoms vary depending on the part of the brain where blood flow is impaired and often overlap with other types of dementia. These include confusion, difficulty with concentration and memory, restlessness, agitation, and depression. Sometimes an increase in symptoms occurs following a series of strokes, but they may also progress in a gradual, steady decline. What are the symptoms of frontotemporal dementia? Frontotemporal dementia is a term used to describe disorders that primarily affect the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain, which causes them to shrink or weaken. These areas of the brain are generally associated with personality, behaviour, and language. People can have dramatic changes in their personality, making them impulsive, lack inhibition, and have repetitive compulsive behaviours, together with difficulty with speech and language. What are the symptoms of dementia with Lewy bodies? Lewy body dementia is the second most common type of progressive dementia after Alzheimer's disease. Protein deposits, called Lewy bodies, develop in cells in the areas of the brain involved in thinking, memory, and movement. Symptoms may include visual hallucinations, rigid muscles, slow movement, walking difficulty, and tremors similar to Parkinson's disease. To find out more, go to opalhealthcare.com.au.
So I thought that was a lovely, concise video, and it breaks up my voice, but it pretty much goes over what we were saying earlier. So when you think about somebody you know that's had dementia, can you think about them experiencing any of those signs and symptoms? Can you think of anybody you know that's had anything like that? Because the difficulty is that sometimes people fear having dementia, and actually there is something else which could be going on with them. The key factor about being formally diagnosed with dementia is it's consistent. It's a consistent behavior that's happening over a period of time, and it's deteriorating. So if you are to go to a doctor, you need to have a diary of events and a diary of things that are happening. And quite often, like exactly as they mentioned about Alzheimer's disease, some of those things are very, very subtle. And it's only when you look back at it, you can actually see that it's happening. If somebody starts presenting with quite acute symptoms, it could be more like it's an infection, or a urine infection, or a chest infection, or something that's caused a delirium. People who are in their 50s and 60s that could be experiencing extreme stress at work, or vitamin deficiency, or who drink a lot, or experiencing menopause, can have very classic symptoms of like early dementia as well. So there's lots of things that can also be like a pseudo dementia but aren't a dementia, and can be treated and resolved. But it's important that if you are sort of having continued symptoms of something, that you go to your doctor and have them checked out. So let me go back to my slides just to keep myself on track. As you can tell, I can easily come off track because it's something I feel very passionate about. So signs, symptoms and behaviours, as we've mentioned before, that everyone's very different, but memory loss, and it's always about short-term things. So people who are affected by dementia, I often think about this, and we used to say like a filing cabinet. In the olden days, we had these, Rolodexes or filing cabinets, and you'd have the files at the front, which are your most common, most, present memories. So like what I had for breakfast, what I'm wearing today, etc. They're your memories at the front. And so further back you go into the filing cabinet are your memories over the years. And the deeper back you go, the more that those memories retain. Because when you think about it, all of those memories in the front, especially things which are like temporary files, things that you have to do. And I actually think nowadays, because we do so much more, our brains can't retain the huge amount of things that we do. So lots of things that are temporary files will go first of all, but our more emotive memories are the things that we retain, which is quite why often people will talk to you about, am I going back home? And they're thinking about a home that they lived at 30 years ago because of the emotional attachment to that. People always say you'll always remember how someone treats you, and I think that's absolutely true. You always tend to remember something which is very emotive to you, be that good or bad. And to take that back to one of the comments which was in the chat earlier about forgetting trauma, actually our brains are very, very clever. And while our brains are functioning well, we can actually push aside trauma. We can work through some very difficult things that happen to us in our lives when we're fully functioning. But as our brain deteriorates, or our brain ages, and our brain is affected by disease, those kind of skills and coping strategies that we've developed to keep those horrible intrusive thoughts away deteriorate and fail too. So that's why you'll often find people who may have had anxiety all their life and had very good coping strategies to cope with those kind of behaviors, have a great social front, lose that and become very, very anxious. Or somebody that's experienced a trauma, like, somebody's died or they've been assaulted, and they've put that to one side and nobody knows about it, and they've kept that very secretive. That can suddenly be revealed, and they relived the trauma and appear to go through a PTSD. There was a woman I worked with, again, when I was in Waltham Forest, and this is years ago, and this is back in the 90s. And at the time, she was in her late 80s, and her mother used to have an illegal abortion clinic. So she had real PTSD about bleach, and like she was always scrubbing her hands because she could remember people coming to her house. And that would have been something which would have been shamefully buried, but also because it was an illegal practice, it would have been something she would have certainly been told, don't even talk about it. But as she then developed dementia, the ability to keep that retained, just disappeared. And so that became something that she spoke about. So the brain is a very, very complex and very interesting. There's another thing with a gentleman who was divorced, and it was a painful divorce. And so he kind of like shut off all the memories connected to that part of the family. And again, when he developed dementia, all of that came back out again. So there's some incredible things that do go on with people. And certainly families definitely struggle with signs and some of the behaviors of people, because it's like, that's not my dad, that's not my mom, that's not something they've done before, that doesn't make sense to me. And there are lots of things like that. Sorry, you were about to say something, I think I heard a comment there. Has anyone got any, can anyone relate to that? Does that sound like something anyone's lived through? Has anyone seen that relatives got behaviours that are very, very different to what they're used to?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I can tell you a million stories like that, you know, literally a million stories of somebody that's never sworn in their life and then suddenly is very disinhibited and their use of language. And that, again, is a lot down to temporal lobes. So our left is all around language, and when we learn, we retain all of our language skills in our left. And if the temporal lobe of the left is impaired and affected, we start to lose those language skills, but we retain our right. Right is our rhythm, which is why singing for the brain and anything musical is so important. So if you start to deteriorate with your speech, you'll always be able to retain rhythm. So we've done lots of work with people where we tap, and when we tap we talk like this, and when we talk like this, and people are more able to talk who can't have a sentence, but when you're using rhythm they can, or you can retain singing. But the interesting thing about the right temporal lobe as well is that it keeps collected words that you've rejected from your left. So you may have been told, don't say that, it's offensive, don't use that word, it's a swear word, or it's racist, or it's sexist, or anything which is negative was rejected from your left language skills because your social ability knew that that's not appropriate to use that, but it's stored as a backup in your right. So if you lose your left, your right will bring out some backup, which is why people suddenly say racist things or sexist things, or they swear because they're trying to replace. So the things have gone from the left, they'll pop out from the right. And that's quite an interesting thing to think about too, about some people's behaviour. So bear that one in mind, because it's quite important. But certainly when you've got somebody you're working with or a family member who's really struggling to speak, then you'll find that, rhythm, music is so important, and you really can do a lot with that. And you'll notice that if somebody has got quite a lot of non-verbal ability, they'll always be able to tap along and stay in beat to music, and then language will come out from that. It comes out in familiar songs. It's a really interesting thing, and there's lots of musical videos on YouTube that I can share with you about that as well. Has anyone got any questions about this so far? I'm aware I talk a lot. Someone's put in there about over-friendly with the opposite sex. Absolutely. And we run memory meetups like fortnightly in the borough, and we have lots of couples that attend, and it's fair to say that's quite a common concern. And I can see every time that the carer, the wife or the husband is absolutely mortified by this behaviour. It's embarrassing, and it creates shame. But it is a part of the condition, and it is part of not necessarily for everybody. But if your brain's impacted and infected in that way, then you're sort of like loss of social understanding of your behaviour being inappropriate. I always feel like when a person is disinhibited in that way, they would probably be mortified if they knew they were behaving in that way. But it's the way that you react as a person to not go along with situations like that, but not confront. Is a very person-centered way of reacting and working with people. That's another conversation to keep going when we get to different realities as well. But I think certainly that's one of the challenges of living with dementia, one of those behaviours. As dementia deteriorates, people always commonly think about memory loss, but there's lots of things like making cups of tea, concentrating, planning, organizing, all the fact that we have different abilities, and we're always trying to do about 10 things at once in life. So when you think about it, how many steps does it take to make a cup of tea? Let's pose that as a question to stop me talking for a minute. How many steps do you think it takes to make a cup of tea? I think Jan, you said 9. Did you say 9? I was reading your lips. Yeah.
Yes, 9.
You said about 9. Anyone higher than 9? Anyone got any increase on 9 or less than 9?
It can take.
I've got my cup of tea, so I'm relishing you all thinking about this one for a moment. How many steps do you think it took me to negotiate making a cup of tea?
5.
4. Okay, let's think about it. First of all, I have to think I want a cup of tea, so that's 1. Then I have to think, where's my kitchen? That's 2. I have to think about getting into my kitchen, that's 3. I have to think about possibly turning on a light, that's 4. I have to think about where the cup was stored. I have to think about where the tea was stored. I have to think about where the sugar's stored. I have to think about where the milk is stored. I have to think about how I open that. I have to think about where the water is. I have to think where the kettle is. I have to switch the kettle on. I'm going to keep going. It's about 40 things that are in making a cup of tea. And if you think about that right now, if you were to go and make a cup of tea, you'd also be thinking to yourself, I wonder what my daughter's doing today. I wonder what time I have to do this. And you've got a million things happening in your brain at any one time. But when you actually think about somebody who then starts to have an illness, which is shrinking their brain or deteriorating aspects in their brain, then you can imagine how complicated and how that starts to break down. But when we work with people, we meet them halfway, or we meet them where their needs are. So rather than taking away a skill that someone has, you try and retain their skill and keep them doing. So it could be that the person puts the cup out themselves and you pour the water in, but then the person puts the tea bag in, and you work with the person's needs. So you always give the person the best experience. Tony's saying Alison. Yes, Tony.
Take green tea. If you drink green tea, it'll cut down the number of steps you have to do.
That's a very good idea, actually, Tony. I completely agree with you. If you drink herbal tea or ginger tea or something like that, you haven't got to worry about the milk, at least, have you? Or whether the milk's out of date, etc. But Alison, actually, you win the prize because you're on 20 there. And Rosa, I love this. You have coffee in the morning, tea at midday, and last tea before going to bed. That's not enough hydration, though. You need a bit more hydration there. Someone was telling me the other day that on average we need 2 litres, but as we get older we need to have more. And again, you always find that older people drink less because there's a fear about going to the toilet, not being able to get up quick enough, or they don't drink before they go out. And there's, again, all of this sits with our sort of like fear. We fear having accidents and making fools of ourselves, but actually without enough water and hydration in our body, we actually make things worse for ourselves, and we can get more confused. So there's a lot of benefits of green tea though, Tony. I completely agree with that. It really, really is. It's a really good thing to have. Staying on track, difficulty staying on track should be my one, but you see what I mean? It's like I have a lot of information in my head at any one time, and you can imagine that, you know, I have word finding difficulties because I'm going through the menopause, and you know, I think to myself sometimes what your brain will do when you have word finding difficulties. I have good days and bad days. Your brain will try and look for something as a substitute. So it's like, you know, I remember one time I couldn't remember what a lawnmower was called, and I kept saying to myself, it's like a Hoover, but it cuts the grass. Because my brain's trying to look for something which looks something similar. So it's like if you forget the name of a pen, you'll be looking for an instrument that looks like that. Your brain's going through these files to try and connect them back up and try and find something to associate it. And the more your brain has a disease and loses those words or those abilities to connect other things, the worse it becomes. And then you start replacing with very unusual things, like rather than thingamybobs, or you're sometimes replaced with something completely different. There was a woman I was working with who used the word French. She'd lose words and she'd always say French. It's one of those French. Well, it's a French, and you'd have to try and decipher what French meant. Sometimes you can kind of get what someone's at, but when they're replacing with something completely different, it's a lot harder. So is this making sense to everybody? Is this, yes, is it helpful? Brilliant, wonderful. So language, yes, I can hear somebody saying
it's me, other Alison.
Hi, Alison.
What you were saying about, I mean, I'm of an age, and I'm not sure whether I'm going through or have been through the menopause, but there are times when I'm literally trying to talk about something like you were describing the lawnmower. I don't mix up names or anything like that, although I do call my husband my son and various all the boys in my family. I go, no, that one. But it was interesting what you were saying about like menopause, and also you've mentioned about depression and things.
Yes.
And sometimes I think, oh, is it really dementia, or has it been that, or has it been this? And things like that. It's fascinating to find out where it comes from, I suppose.
I think the key thing is about consistent, but saying that, I mean, menopause is a horrible, debilitating condition too, and it can last, 10, 15 years, God help us all. But, and symptoms of that vary and change. But I think the clear thing about a dementia trajectory is that it deteriorates and it deteriorates in different ways. And so, that with a vascular dementia, they always talk about it being more like steps. So you'll be all right for a little while, then there's a deterioration, and then you'll be all right for a little while, then there's a deterioration. So it looks like a bit like a staircase, whereas if with more like an Alzheimer's type, it's a steady deterioration over time. And again, the younger you are when you develop a dementia, sometimes the quicker you deteriorate, or your symptoms are more profound and notable. Unfortunately, there's certain types of dementia where people become more agitated. It's just, again, where parts of your brain are affected. But then again, it also depends on you as a personality. Again, sometimes some of people's behavior is always reactive to how you feel. So, people are often reactive to how they're being spoken to, how they're being treated, how they're frustrated. And we've come a long way with dementia care. There's a lot more counselling, there's a lot more support and advice available. People know they have dementia now. People are told, it's disclosed to them. When I first started working with people with dementia, this is like back in the early 90s, and person-centred care was just coming out. A person wasn't necessarily told they had dementia, but their family members were. And so there'd be people saying to me, I just don't feel right. I feel like there's something in my head. I feel fizzy. And I'd say, what do you think it could be? But bear in mind, they've not been told by the doctor. Their family members have been told and they hadn't. Whereas if now you're told, you're absolutely told, whether you can retain that or cope with that, or whether you can understand that, depending on where you're at, but you are told. And there's lots of people living well with dementia because they feel that, because they're aware of what's happening with them, they've developed coping strategies. People work with dementia, people drive with dementia. There seems to be a difference. So back then, I think people were probably spotted later, and by that point already they were at a stage where they were very impaired. But it depends when you're spotted. But yeah, I mean, menopause, stress, vitamin deficiencies, they all impact memory. And so people have this whole thing about forgetting words or forgetting things. You often find people that are overworked or stressed, they'll have sort of like classic symptoms, but not necessarily anything else. And so it's like, having numerous symptoms and them being consistent, and there being the deterioration, and over a prolonged period of time, that's when you start going, actually, something's going on here. But people do have a lot of anxiety too. I mean, I had a neighbour when I was growing up, and she was always frightened to death she was going to get dementia. And she was so hyper aware of what the signs and symptoms and behaviours were, it kind of produced an anxiety in her. Then when you get that anxiety, it kind of mirrors different behaviours too. So like I said, our brain is very, very powerful. Jenny's written something really interesting in the chat here. Caffeine is not dementia friendly. 100%, Jenny, I really agree with that. Caffeine's not friendly, full stop. Like, I'm on decaf myself at the moment because when I am overworking, my anxiety levels, and probably because I'm menopausal too, my anxiety levels can raise, and I'm very caffeine sensitive. So it just depends on everybody, but 100% there. Valuable water, fruits and vegetables, healthy living is very, very important. So thank you for that. Alison, I'll attest to track the progression of dementia. That's really interesting, Tony, actually. There possibly are so many apps now, actually, it's like technology has advanced so much that there probably are. But I mean, commonly what they would do would be, you're presenting with symptoms, you get the courage, or you get forced along sometimes in some people's cases, or you go yourself, you're self-determined to go and have a dementia assessment. You go along to a GP will do bloods initially to make sure there isn't something else going on with you. And then you'll be referred for a CT or MRI scan, and then you'll have a assessment at Enfield Memory Service. And then the discussion will be about what kind of type of dementia it possibly be. They always kind of like look to what type of dementia it is. And often now they'll either go, mixed dementia. And I really feel the reason why lots of people talk about things being a mixed dementia is because they can give you medication, which was predominantly prescribed for Alzheimer's. So if you have a mixed dementia, they can trial you on this type of medication, which definitely delays the progress of dementia. So we've come a long way that's routinely prescribed. Again, when I first started working with people with dementia, you'd have a private prescription for that, and you'd have to see the same local authority consultant privately to be able to, to obtain that medication. But it's commonly prescribed, and there's different medications that they work in combination with that now, and it's very trial and error. And sometimes the medications, there's a medication that will delay the progress of dementia for some types of dementia only. So some like Terry Pratchett, he had, sorry, I've forgotten the type it was now, but it was a very rare type of dementia that about 12 people in the UK have, and there's no medication that will prevent that from happening or delay that. And vascular dementia at the moment, there's trials to try and slow that down as well. But I always think with interventions, there's always a lot of money being put into dementia research to try and improve things and slow things down. There probably are amazing apps now that can track progression, I think, because back then there wasn't. You'd have this dementia test, and then somebody would then go back to their GP because there was a behaviour that challenged or a behaviour that people, I can't cope, something's happening here. So the memory service will do an assessment of you. You'll perhaps attend a Living Well with Dementia course or a cognitive stimulation therapy course. They'll refer you to AgeUK, who's got the memory care navigators. And sometimes you don't want any of that, and you go off and you do your own thing, and then things deteriorate, and then you want to come back and access services. And generally what people do then is they come back to their GP, or they come to a voluntary sector charity, or maybe they go to adult social care and say, I can't cope with this behaviour. And sometimes the behaviour means that the older people's mental health team will get involved to look at what that challenging behaviour might be, or the behaviour that challenges, and they might prescribe a different medication which just takes the edge off things. And we've come a huge way from where we were in the 90s there. Back in the 90s, there was a medication that would always be prescribed to people that would just knock them out. There's no question about it. And it would restrict them. And the side effects of that caused another condition, which was quite alarming. So, and there was a lot of what we'd say is chemical koshing going on with people that were in care homes where they were given too much of this medication, which then caused falls. And it was a very, very negative experience. And we've come a long way from there. It's not perfect, but we have certainly come a long way from there. I think the education, people's awareness of dementia has become a more common understood disease. People know about it. It's the Alzheimer's do a very good Dementia Action Week every year, and the advert this year was very, very powerful. So there's a lot more awareness of people, and people commonly talk about it. People know they've got family members involved, but 28 years ago when I first started, it was still very stigmatized like cancer, and people didn't want to have conversations about it. So to answer it in a very long way, Tony, there probably is. It's something I'll probably go off and Google when I come out of this, and it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, certainly researchers have participants that will track their own feelings and behaviour by using tests or on apps. So it might be that they periodically do that, so then they can see it. But it's you can see it's despite it being such a disgusting and debilitating illness for so many people, it's actually quite fascinating to try and understand dementia and how it affects us as people. But maybe that's just me because I'm a bit of a dementia geek. To come back onto my track, as you can kind of see, I get very passionate about dementia and I come off track and I have to keep myself on. Misunderstanding what's being seen is a really common thing. So perception is interesting. Can anybody think of anything which might be a challenge to someone with dementia? What kind of things might people see incorrectly around the home or in shops or places that you visit?
I find my mum has very in-depth conversations with the characters on Rosemary and Thyme and Wycliffe. She loves watching detection shows.
Right.
And then she'll start having a very, I told you, I warned you, which is not far off what I'm like. And I'm watching television and going, I knew it was that, but she's actually there. And also WhatsApp video, FaceTime doesn't work for her.
Yes, definitely. Yes, technology. I mean, technology again, it's just a blessing and a curse, isn't it? So we've come a long way with technology. But I did this really interesting project with people about selfies. So, for front-facing cameras and selfies to sort of like capture people how they were feeling. And if you're in a different reality, if you think you're an 18-year-old man, but you're an 80-year-old man, being faced by seeing yourself in your front-facing camera or in the mirror can be quite distressing. Because you're suddenly thinking, that's my dad, that's my granddad I'm looking at. If that's where your reality is, and people are sometimes in the correct reality and sometimes in a different reality, and it can fluctuate through the course of the day, and sometimes that doesn't affect people at all. But if you are, then that's a massive reality shock actually. And as practitioners, we moved away from, there's a thing called reality orientation. And again, when I first started working with people with dementia, there was reality orientation boards everywhere you went. It's Tuesday, it's 10:30, it's about to rain, trying to keep people reined into where they should be. And there's some awful stories about, when people say that they've forgotten that their loved ones died. There was this awful situation where someone once put in their glasses case, your mum's dead. So every time they opened the glasses case, they were presented with a note that said your mum's dead. And, so then you're going to relive that every single time you read the note. And you can understand why the person did it, because they thought, I have to keep telling her all the time where her mum is. And so that's why she wrote it. But can you imagine constantly reliving the loss of someone that you love every single time? And so everyone's kind of moved away from this kind of like reality orientation and meeting people where they need to be met. And that does not mean we collude with people, because collusion is another thing. So if someone's telling you that, when people have visual hallucinations and they say, oh, there's a child sitting at the end of my sofa, if you go, oh yeah, that's a lovely child, isn't it? Then you're colluding with somebody. And if a person's reality then changes again, they won't believe you, they won't trust you, because you've indulged in something which wasn't real. But confronting them and saying, don't be so stupid, that's not there, is not going to help either. But having a conversation with someone about, what do you think is there? And sort of like, oh, I can see why you might think that, by the way that the sun shines in or something, might lead someone to actually recognizing that isn't the case. So especially things around visual perceptions are like a dark map, like a hole. There's lots of care homes, they're very tasteful now actually, but in the past to have awful flooring where a person might think, oh, it's the floor's melting, or I'm going to get lost in the flooring. Or mirrors, not just mirrors but reflective, like picture frames with reflective glass where you see someone different or see someone else. Sometimes lampshades, things that if you're tired yourself, out the corner of your eye you catch something thinking, I'm not quite sure if that's there or not. That's a perception or difficulty that someone with dementia might experience as well. So there are lots of challenges, both for the person living with dementia and their family members, and how you deal with those kind of situations. And I know someone was trying to talk there actually. So somebody had something to say. Has anyone got any thoughts about this? Visual perceptions. Dementia hereditary. It can be, Tony. It can be, but not necessarily. Again, like with cancers, the genetic tests that you can have to define whether, and again with cancer, because it's 1 in 2 people, 1 in 14 people have got dementia. Sometimes it's coincidental. Sometimes it's like anything. We don't necessarily, although that's coming, we don't necessarily know what we're predisposed to, but our genetics and health inequalities, which they will be able to start testing and seeing which we're more predetermined for, most definitely as science is moving forward. But I've been around the block a long time, as I've said to you. I think in all that time, I've worked with 3 people that it was genetic, and they were all frontotemporal dementia. So they were all what was then Pick's disease, and they were all below 40 or 50 when it started, and so were their parents. So it's far more common in that way. But Alzheimer's types, I've seen less hereditary forms. But they do happen, but it's not so common. But people worry about that. My dad worried about that. My granddad had dementia, and my dad was absolutely paranoid that was going to be him, and it wasn't. It's just one of those things. Okay, I've come definitely off my own track. As I told you, I'm very passionate about dementia, so I knew that this was going to happen. And can anyone think about moods and behaviours that you attach to dementia? How people feel? Is there anything that people think about commonly, that people express? Agitation is very common. People think about agitation and irritability, but when you think about agitation and irritability, it's cause and effects. There's always something which will trigger that, and sometimes it's down to feeling frustrated with yourself at the time, having a conscious awareness that things are not going in the way that you want them to. But if you equally think that you're an 18-year-old, but actually you're an 88-year-old, someone correcting you is going to make that a trigger. Aggression, certainly. Fear of being left alone, absolutely, and afraid of the dark. And the evening's a really interesting thing, isn't it, Frankie? Because people talk about sundowners, where often people are worse at the latter part of the day. And they'll either have nocturnal wandering, that fear in the evenings that you want to get out, you want to get home, and that's absolutely a fear. Because even though you're in your home and you might have lived in your home for 50 years, in your emotional memory, you possibly then are in a different reality and think you're younger and you want to get back to your mum and your dad, because that's security. So lots of language that people use is around expression. So when people say, I want to get home to my mum and my dad, or you know, something which attaches back to early years, that's normally more of an expression of feeling anxious or insecure, or something around your circumstances is making you feel that way. There's a fantastic film you could all watch with Anthony Hopkins in it. I don't know if anyone's seen that, The Father. It's an, yeah, Jan's put a finger at her thumb up. It's an amazing film, and it's very subtle and clever, and it really gives you the lived experience of what someone's going through. Jenny, absolutely. When your parents are not in the country of origin, 100%, and people, you know, loss of language going back to their original language skills, but then their original language skills or their original language, you know, is lost with the sort of muddle of dementia too. There was a guy who came to us when I was working in Redbridge, and he was Sri Lankan, and he had a very unusual dialect of Tamil, and one of my team spoke Tamil, but his language skills were so muddled. But also, he'd been very, very shielded and protected by the family, as he'd been diagnosed with dementia and never accessed any help or support at all. Then his wife had had an emergency admission to hospital, and so he was brought along to a day service so that he could be supported in the day so his children could work. And this guy was terrified. He'd never had any formal support, and he's speaking a different language and dialect to anybody else. He'd never known formal services, and all he wanted to do was literally run out of the building, and he was clambering against walls. And, you know, we're very person-centered practitioners, but if you think about it, it's like you wouldn't have even begun to realize what was going on with you. All he wanted to do was be with his wife, and his wife is in hospital and he couldn't be with her. So he literally managed to get out of the building, and we had to drive alongside him as he walked up the road to try and, you know, one of us was on the pavement trying to stop him from going into the world. So panicked he was to get away from him, because we would have been his captors. And, you know, not being able to express yourself too is horrific. So I often say to people that our carers, start to introduce somebody as early as possible. Even if that person is coming to a group, even if that person is coming in to do a bit of housework, you're extending and widening your circle, and that's really important, because God forbid you have an emergency admission, and then for you it's traumatic because you're thinking, who can I leave my loved one with? But for the person that you're caring for, they haven't got that recognition, it's not familiar to them, there's no kind of like place. So that's a really simple tip for anyone to think of. If you're diagnosed with dementia, or someone's diagnosed with dementia, immediately think about those circles of support, start building on those, and make those introductions, even if it's for half an hour. And if a person comes along and goes, well, bloody hate that group, it's awful, it's still widening it, and there's other people there that will be feeling the same as you. So those are really simple tips. Jenny's put something else as well. People feeling embarrassed what's happened, and parents hiding them away. Absolutely is. One of the things I've put on a slide here, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to be very brief, was about challenges. You know, what's the biggest challenge of living with dementia? And stigma and what other people think is one of them, certainly. Sometimes it's about your own place, where you acknowledge that I'm not the person that I was, and that's so debilitating. To have that kind of feeling about yourself can be limiting. But quite often it's about other people's expectations of you, or lack of expectations of you, other people's misconceptions of dementia, other people's stigma of dementia, shame and guilt, and all of those kind of emotional things can be real challenges for people affected by dementia. There was a woman I was working with, and she was Irish, and she said to me, because I said to her, you're amazing that you're able to talk about your lived experience. And she goes, yeah, but loads of my friends don't want to talk to me anymore because they know I've got dementia, and so they're frightened. And you find that in independent living or sheltered housing, people won't sit next to somebody, or they won't come along to an event because somebody there. And imagine you being that person, you know. And it's the same with any long-term condition, certainly the same with, you know, people with cancer. Sometimes people don't know how to, or someone who's lost a loved one, people themselves don't know how to react, so they'll avoid the person. So it all comes down to our own feelings. So that's why education awareness is really important. Tony, thank you. What support is available to people? So if you're worried about your memory, the first step is that you go to see your GP, and the GP will do tests with you. And if they feel that you're eligible to have further testing, they refer you to Enfield Memory Service. If you're diagnosed with dementia from Enfield Memory Service, we have AgeUK Enfield has a contract with the clinical commissioning group to support people who are newly diagnosed, and so we will work with somebody from point of diagnosis there. We'll also work with someone who's diagnosed with dementia at any point, because, like I say, some people are like, I'm absolutely great, don't need any help, and they go off. And then what tends to happen is a little while later they'll come back. So AgeUK Enfield has memory navigators, or health and wellbeing navigators, that can support somebody with dementia, and they'll help them with coping strategies, income maximization, security, housing, later life planning, all of those things, but also connect to people, understanding coping strategies, all of that. Then our good colleagues at Enfield Carer Centre do fantastic work around supporting carers who are affected by dementia, and they have monthly groups. The older people's mental health team are in the process of developing a carers group. The older people's mental health team have an Admiral nurse. I think they've still got one part-time Admiral nurse who's around, and an Admiral nurse will work with carers of people affected by dementia to sort of to join up stuff around medication, connecting to the community, etc. The Alzheimer Society don't work in the same way that they used to years ago. I used to work for the Alzheimer Society, so I know it. But they have fantastic sessions like Singing for the Brain, and the Alzheimer Society are always your go-to place about information. They have amazing resources, fact sheets, they have online forums, they have lots of information. And because they are the leading experts on dementia, there is not anything they can't share with you. And if you ever have a question about dementia that you're really stuck on, they have a knowledge hub, and they're fantastic there. So locally, there is a huge array of dementia-friendly activities in the borough. So the Rotary clubs have sessions. Start quite choking now. I can send you a list of dementia-friendly activities that run. There's literally an activity for people affected by dementia every day, which is like a cafe kind of club lunch, experience. There's day services like the Parker Centre and Rose Taylor. Then you'll have things like Jewish Care, which are just on the outside, but will still support people. There are amazing care homes like Elsing House, which are opening up their facilities so that us from the community can go and do joint work there too. So not just you move in there, they're allowing us to use. So we're looking to develop a cinema there. So there's lots of opportunity. And this, yes, short, you can email me and I'll send you all that information at all. Yes, Maureen, we can send out information. I can send a list to you, Jan, no problem at all. You can put it on the website. Yes, you'll share my contact details. How do you manage negative talk from a dementia, someone experiencing dementia? Frankly, that's a really interesting point. When you talk about negative talk, are they talking about themselves? Are they thinking about someone? Are they talking negatively about their situation?
They're talking negatively about things that's happened in the past.
Okay.
They keep repeating it, and it's never positive talk. It's always so you fear of having a conversation with that person because within 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes it's going to end up in a negative conversation about someone who did. You talked about you always remember the good things that someone's done for you, but this person always remembers the bad things. How can you move them along from that? Because if you say you don't want to hear it, then they get upset.
Yeah. Is it something that someone's done to them? Is it something, or their perception of somebody? I mean, this is probably a conversation we can have outside. I'm quite happy to do that. Yeah. I'll give you my email address. I mean, I'll put it in the chat, and check me an email and we'll arrange a conversation, because it's going to probably take longer than the time that we've got left. And I appreciate that, because I don't want to cut you short. And I think there's probably some coping strategies we can give you for that. It is really difficult, because the thing is that person's expressing, aren't they? So it's a feeling they're expressing. And the hardest thing I think about being a loved one and a good professional, because let's just be honest, there are bad professionals who don't give people time, but a good professional would validate, you're validating what that person said to you. And so then you'd use things like, that must make you feel like, but that's because you're a professional that's going to clock off at a certain time. And when you're a 24/7 carer, that's a completely different thing altogether. So but there are things that we can do around that. I put my email address in there. The only reason I haven't put my mobile in, guys, is because I can't actually remember my number, which is pretty awful, isn't it? I've got a new mobile, I don't know what it is, but if you email me, I will give you my mobile number as well. Okay. My brain's not perfect, believe me, it has a lot of information in it, but this is see what I mean? It's a very, very quick overview that I can talk about dementia for hours and days, and there's different things that'll be really useful, but do get in touch. And if there's anything else I can help you all with, and Jan, and Chris, I'm always happy to do another follow-up session about something else which is bespoke, if it helps. You can see why it goes. Time has gone really quickly this morning, hasn't it? Yes, indeed.
Thank you, Alison. Your talk was really informative and wide-ranging, and also thanks to everyone who's contributed. Anyone got any more questions or comments that they want to make?
Can I make a quick comment?
Of course.
Yeah, thank you so much as well. My friend alerted me to this, so thanks, Eamon. And my mum's a person that has dementia, Alzheimer's. And I think what Frankie said is really interesting. And I do a lot of work around pelvic floor, menopause, and just the mental emotional and the history and the trauma that's locked inside of them. So one of the things that happens obviously with Alzheimer's patients, well, some Alzheimer's patients, not all, is if they've had some trauma in their past, as in the person that you're maybe working with, Frankie, that's what tends to come up. It's unfortunately the negative history that's been buried for ages tends to surface in this climate. So it's kind of stressful for the person hearing it, because you think, get over it, but that person, that part of the brain just seems to be on rewind and replay. So maybe 100%. Just using things like music. So if I find my mum takes herself to a sort of negative point, I will try to change the topic, or I'll put some music on and a song that she likes, and all of a sudden, sometimes she may stay there for a while, but we try to put like music on, or something different that will just take her mind to another place. And usually again, there's old records that they remember from yesteryear, and all of a sudden, it may take a few moments, but they take themselves to that point, and that can just divert them. They're going to come back to it because it's on replay, but at least you've got that. So you just got to replay the same record, and all of a sudden you stuck on the same record yourself as well. But it kind of takes them away from where they are, and it helps you.
Jenny, I think we've got a mutual friend of Lewy. Is Lewy your friend as well?
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah, I thought so. I thought I recognised your name as well. I've recognised your picture. But absolutely, you're Jenny, 100% right. Let's connect, because I'd like to talk to you about menopause too. But I'm also noticing the more I'm working with people in the menopause, that 100% I knew this was the case, because when I first started working with people with dementia, I soon realised that actually there was a lot of resolution work I was doing with people. So I realised that people were confiding in things to me that they hadn't shared with their family members, and they were letting out things that they'd kept for a very long time, especially the generations of people I was working with then. Imagine they would have been in their 80s, 90s and the 90s. So it was a very repressed society. But I can see now from working with menopausal groups of women that it's a pause in your life, which suddenly it stacks out all this trauma that people have lived with, and they get to 40, 50, 60, and they're suddenly like, I can't cope with that. So it's like almost if we do resolution work at this age, we'll prevent it later on, which is a progression from where we were at with older people before. So it's really important. So please get in touch with me. I'd love to do some work for you.
I've saved your email, and I was on a Clubhouse thing this morning talking about menopause, and last night, and it really is such an emotive topic. But if we understand the relationship to where we find ourselves and the past traumas, 100%. I think we're in a great place now, because people are beginning to speak, and so we can only help the people that are in this situation, but we can save the people that are coming up. We don't have to have the same experience.
Thank you, Jenny. There's been such. The last plug I'm going to make on that is that we've talked a lot about women. For men, we know it's completely different, and we know there's lots of, again, societal gender differences which make it very difficult for men. So we're going to be launching Men in Sheds, and I would really love the Over 50s Forum to support us with this, because we know you've got a wide membership, and we need to make this a success. We can, in Essex, they've got 37 sheds, and it's amazing, and the shed will be, co-produced. It's for men by men, not essentially just for men, but we know that there's gaps, and it was a really safe place. So we'd love you to be involved in that and help us get that off the ground. So do give us a message about that and see what we can do, because again, it's like, there's a space where guys can talk about their things, and our coordinator is fantastic, and he went along to this group, and they were talking about, they were busy doing an activity, and then one of them said something to another one about, I don't know, erectile dysfunction or something, and then this group of guys were having a conversation which they never would have had at any other time, but because they were busy doing the piece of work, they had a conversation. So again, you could say, oh, maybe you should see a doctor about that. So it gives people a chance to get help in a safe environment, rather than if you only talk about that, no one will turn up at all. But if it's in a shed, maybe that goes on, and just the person that's the coordinator is switched on to know, oh, if you go to the Over 50s, they could tell you a bit more about that. It helps. So let's connect everybody to get that going, because we really need it in Enfield. So thank you so much. Equally prevalent in both genders. It always seems to be quite favourably disadvantaged to women, I have to say. It's really interesting. I'm looking at this whole link between menopause too. I think it's because I'm aging myself, but there are lots of things that are quite concerning. But one of the things that really does annoy me is NHS dentists. Let's just get that out there. Our teeth, again, are kind of gates to our health. It's preventative work. It's important for us to have accessible, affordable dentistry. And the pandemic's caused us a bit of a problem with that. But there's a lot of link factors to, gum disease, which then produces vascular issues, which then can, potentially cause dementia. So there's a lot of preventative stuff we need to do, and eating, exercising, etc., etc. And I know you guys have got a fantastic event on the 15th of November to share all that information at as well at the Over 50s Forum at Fusion. So we'll see you there. But everyone wants to email me, you're welcome to. I'm happy to come back again at another time and try and rein myself in. And thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you everybody for your contributions today. It's been fabulous. I'm very excited.
Thank you again, Alison. It was absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. At this stage, normally we'd clap, but I'm afraid that doesn't really work online. But thank you very much indeed. And thanks to everyone for coming. And hope to see